Oh, wait, we are live.
In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate. In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout...
Why did it loop?
Actually, you're also not muted. When none of us are muted, they can hear us, even with the overlay there.
Oh, well, this is going really well already. Hello, Sublation Media listeners, viewers, and Sublation Press readers. My name is Ashley Frawley, and as you can tell, I'm doing a terrible job of taking over as co-host of the Sublation Magazine show today.
Hello, everyone. We're your substitute teachers today.
And that is why we're terrible. I also have to say I look terrible because I've got a problem with my eyes, so I couldn't put on any makeup, and I'm squinting, not because I'm on drugs or something, but because I have this problem. But I did not want...
She's showing you what a natural woman looks like.
I know. I did not want to leave everyone without their favorite show, obviously, so I stepped up regardless, and Stefan has also stepped up, and I thank you so much. So for those of you who don't know, Stefan is part of the Sublation Media team, also my PhD student, very capable student who's producing some excellent work. And I wanted to talk today about something a little bit more serious, which is obviously what everyone is talking about, that Roe v. Wade was overturned on Friday. So this has caused obviously an uproar. There's a lot of discussion on social media. If you don't know, or you've been living under a rock, Roe v. Wade was a landmark U.S. Supreme Court decision, which ruled that state bans on abortion are unconstitutional. And this ruling effectively means that states can now make up their own laws regarding abortion law. Stefan?
Yeah, and obviously, kind of states have long prepared for this. So it's not that Roe v. Wade has been overturned and then there's going to be in these states like a long legislative process which can be objected to and obstructed by a populace and an opposition which might be in the majority. Rather, across 13 states in the United States, they have what are called trigger laws, which sometime between Saturday and 30 days after Friday will automatically ban abortion in these states. Already 9 states have banned abortion, made it a criminal offense, and in another 2, there are no abortion providers. So while it's technically legal, there's no legal way to get an abortion in any of these states. Already, abortion's been de facto illegal in a lot of states in the United States, where due to a lack of providers, it's been almost impossible to get an abortion in state. But obviously, this will make the situation significantly worse.
Yeah, and of course, in a lot of states, the laws are a bit ambiguous. There are laws on the books from, the 1920s, and then there's later laws, and they didn't know, they're in a kind of limbo. So there have been cases where doctors and nurses had to go out into a waiting room literally on Friday afternoon and say, look, we can't provide any more services because we don't know what our legal standing is here, and we need to defer to our lawyers. And that was it. And there were like people who traveled 12 hours from out of state, crying and so on. It's very, very difficult for people. Obviously, not everyone's able to travel. As someone who never learned to drive, which is very embarrassing, but apparently it's a very common thing for people who come from difficult circumstances. I never learned to drive. And for me, transportation is a really difficult thing. My heart goes out to those people. Imagine all of these difficulties when you come from a difficult background. A lot of working class people, a lot of poorer people find it very, very hard to travel. Obviously, people are still going to access abortions. They will find solutions. They will travel, but the ability to do that is often restricted. So there's a lot of downplaying what this actually means, but in the lives of the actual people who are living it right now, it's quite a serious thing that's happened.
Yeah, I mean, it's also seismic in the sense that kind of it's overturned something which was meant to be kind of settled in the United States. I think for liberals and progressive, it's very, very shocking because it kind of erases this idea that history is kind of a one-way street. Abortion was meant to be kind of one of these basic things, and was actually obviously legalized much, much earlier than anything like the anti-sodomy laws or the beginning of gay marriage or various other things. It was something that was meant to be have been resolved 50 years ago, but now it's going to be something that's illegal in many states.
Yeah, and we've at Sublation Magazine run a few articles over the past month, and we'll go through what some of our authors have had to say about it. But just before we do, I just had a few thoughts, and I know Stefan, you've had a few thoughts about what all of this, what all this means, and where it's come from. I think, as you say, it seemed like a done deal, and I think that's kind of part of the issue here. That sometimes, for me, it appears to have become something that people defaulted to as a kind of left-wing position, even though the base on which that position was kind of founded was beginning to erode quite seriously. So these older kind of liberal norms or liberal ideas or values and principles about bodily autonomy, about privacy, these are really eroding on the left, and yet people were still upholding pro-choice positions. And I found it really troubling looking at some of the discourse online, looking at some of the arguments and how kind of hollow they have been. And it's really scary because now it's left up to democratic which is a good thing, by the way, but it's left up to democratic decision making at a time when we're not able to make the arguments necessary to win that democratic fight. We're just sort of out of practice or lost the values. I'm
going to say some kind of negative things generally about the magazine articles we talked to, but I think it's important to emphasize, as you've been saying, for all the ways that I have problems with these articles, at least they are, each of them, something substantive. And 1,000 times better than anything I've read on Twitter, or it's been pushed to my feed. Like, obviously you have the stuff where like, oh, this only affects poor women, which beyond kind of being like obviously false is something which is like so absolutely hackneyed at this point. It's like, it's as bad as the people who like, what if Batman just paid those criminals instead of beating them up?
But yeah, but I think, like, for example, I tweeted about this where someone was like, oh, all you people who were out in the streets a little while ago about vaccine passports, you were talking about bodily autonomy. Where are you now? Like that they have this inconsistent position. But the thing is that all these people who were banging on about vaccine passports, i.e. they wanted them, are now shocked when this
yeah, I mean, that's throwing a pretty big rock in your glass house.
Yeah, right. And I think possibly because we came out of COVID, and a lot of these same people were making these kinds of arguments that, oh, bodily autonomy is just a cover for selfishness and so on. They found it very, very difficult to make arguments about bodily autonomy when it comes to abortion. And I think it's, so I'll actually just read out some of the tweets and responses that I've had, because I found it interesting, where I was like, well, this is an inconsistent position, right? Because what you're saying is bodily autonomy doesn't matter when it comes to vaccines. Now, of course, I understand it's a little bit more complicated because of herd immunity, but we weren't dealing with herd immunity with COVID-19 because it wasn't a sterilizing, with that vaccine, because it wasn't a sterilizing vaccine. It more protected yourself. And still people made these arguments, right? And so somebody responds to me, well, actually, we were talking about protecting the broader population there, and it's not, it's a different thing, essentially. And I don't think it's that much different, because outside of pregnancy, there are actually very few circumstances in which you can infringe upon the bodily autonomy of one person to save the life of another, for the good of another, or even to save the life of another. So, for example, the case of Mccall versus Shimp in the United States, in Pennsylvania, is really instructive here. So Robert Mccall was dying of aplastic anemia, and he had asked the courts to order his cousin, the only compatible family member, to donate bone marrow. And his cousin, Shimp, refused. And the court decided ultimately that while Shimp's refusal was morally reprehensible, they could not compel him to donate. And if they did compel him to donate his bone marrow, it would undermine almost all the principles underpinning a free and democratic society, which is the autonomy of the individual. Now, I think that this, while this is going to be unpopular, you can't really have it both ways. But it strikes me that we've chipped away at this principle, these kinds of liberal principles that underpin the Roe v. Wade decision, and the liberal principles that underpin the idea you cannot compel somebody to give up a part of their body or to give up their autonomy over their body for the good of another person, even to save another person's life. But we do this routinely with women. We say, like, it's notable that Shimp was a man. And he said, I'm not giving bone marrow. And they said, this is morally reprehensible. But for a woman, you can compel her to use a part of her body to save the life of another. And this is just, taken for granted. But there's a difference. It's interesting because this ruling said that while this person's decision was morally reprehensible, there's a difference between morality and legality. And we are losing that distinction quite a lot. When I've seen so many people saying, oh, there ought to be a law about such and such that they find morally reprehensible. But saying that something is morally bad is different than saying you should be legally compelled to do the right thing, even if you think.
And also, when you understand who in America and elsewhere enforces these laws,
mm-hmm.
like obviously, kind of the most hated institution on the left, the police, is regardless of what the law is and how good it is or whatever, the people
mm-hmm.
that enforce it in the end are going to be the police.
Yeah, of course. And this is like, I got into everybody hates me because I stood up against the smacking ban in Wales. You can think that is morally reprehensible, but that is a different thing than saying, like, yeah, that's a bad thing. Do you want the cops to come in and like enforce the law, enforce a moral something that you think is morally right? No, you have to say, like, you have to be able to defend something even if you think it's morally wrong because of the underlying principle. And we've just lost that entirely. Stefan is in stunned silence.
Yeah, no, I mean, obviously kind of I think that it's useful to actually, point out that in terms of vaccine mandates, there was never I don't think anywhere where you were actually forced to get a vaccine, as opposed to various kind of there have been various social disincentives to doing so. But it is true, I think, that there definitely are people who in the last years would have been like, especially if vaccine rates were not going up to whatever they wanted to, would be like, make people do that. And are the same people that are kind of would like to base an argument for the freedom of abortion on bodily autonomy. And it's just,
right. How much I will take issue with the idea that it's just a social, like, do this thing or I'll burn down your house. Is that a choice? It's like quite serious social sanctions that people were bandying about, because that's right. They wanted to enforce it, but were not able to. But my point is, though, we find it very difficult to defend things, even if we think that they are morally reprehensible. So whether or not you think it's morally reprehensible doesn't matter. That should be completely besides the point. And so what I've seen people doing is they make the argument about incest, about rape, and this sort of thing, and they're saying, well, this is the big argument. And the obvious response to that is that is a tiny proportion of the abortions that are actually performed. But the point is, it's not whether or not you agree with the person's reasons. You don't have to agree with the person's reasons. It's the underlying principle. And this is the thing that strikes me. This is what's happening also with free speech, where people are like, yeah, okay, I support free speech, but blah, 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 when it's morally reprehensible. No. The whole point is that you defend free speech, especially when it's morally reprehensible. Otherwise, there's no reason to have a principle of free speech if we're only ever talking about things that no one ever found offensive. The point is that there is always some group in society that wants to shut something down. And so you have that principle there that says it doesn't matter. If like we'd never have a discussion about free speech if it was only ever about speech that didn't upset the church or some group in society. It's always something that someone finds at a particular time morally reprehensible. But when you protect that speech, you also protect the speech when it comes to you and someone else is saying, no, you shouldn't be allowed to say that. By protecting it for your enemies, you also protect it for yourself.
Yeah, I mean, and kind of, it's not like you're talking about how we shouldn't care about the reasons, but and also I just want to make clear that it's possible that you can have like a legal system where it does include this, but this sucks. Like it used to be the case in various places in the United States where to get an abortion, and I think various other medical procedures, you had to go up in front of like a panel of doctors and basically plead your case. Mm-hmm. But this is obviously just horrible because it obviously takes away the person's freedom, requires them to basically like give an account to this panel of basically all the facts about them, about their family, about their future, and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, on one level, yeah, it's definitely, we shouldn't care about these reasons, and it's not, and we have a system which doesn't care about these reasons. Mm-hmm. But we shouldn't underestimate the power of the state, especially. I think that was an important point made in one of the articles that I think it was from Conrad's, that the modern state has a much greater ability to enforce all of these kinds of things, to enforce your moral law, whatever it may be, even compared to 50 years ago, because of the kind of universal tracking which is implied by the internet.
Can you say more about that? What do you mean?
Like 50 years ago, it would be really hard to find out that someone had like ordered an abortion pill and taken it. Well, now there's a complete digital footprint of everything you do. Mm-hmm. The state can get it. If you buy like an abortion pill off Amazon, or it's obviously not going to be off Amazon, but you know what I mean. And you use your actual debit card and all this kind of stuff, and you can't pay in cash or anything like this. This is a whole kind of chain of information which a state can take and enforce the law against you for. Mm-hmm. With.
Yeah, and this is the thing. This is what happens, that these kinds of policies or these kinds of de facto bans, or now, this kind of legislation, it has all kinds of knock-on effects, all kinds of things. And you'd think like, wow, the people who make laws, they would think about this sort of thing, wouldn't they? But there are things like chemical endangerment laws, like where if a woman takes any kind of substance while she's pregnant, it's, she can go to jail for chemical endangerment of the fetus, which was sold as like, oh, it'll help women to get help, but it actually had the opposite effect and was absolutely. And it was selectively enforced against minority and poor women, and had really horrible knock-on effects. And they just don't care. And you think like, why don't you care about the consequences of what you're doing? And the answer is because these people are not dealing in the real world. These laws are totally symbolic. They are waging symbolic battles because they know they can't, for example, with what we're talking about now with abortion, they know they can't stop people from getting abortions. Abortions will still happen. But they want you, when you break the rules, they want you to know you're breaking their rules. They want their morals to be the morals of society. I use this argument quite a lot, but it's from Joseph Gusfield's Symbolic Crusade, which I highly recommend people read. It really explains quite a lot of contemporary society and politics. It's a book from the 1960s about the American temperance movement. And he kind of asked the question, like, why did these people who don't drink alcohol themselves and, Christian teetotalers, and they don't have friends who drink alcohol, and they tend to live in communities outside of city centers where they didn't come across people who drank alcohol. Why do they care so much about other people's drinking? And the answer is because their power, they had been the hegemonic power of American society for a long time, and their power was beginning to slip. And so this led them to forge these really powerful symbolic crusades. So it was like, even though we're not, our material status has fallen, our moral status can rise. And so people think like, oh, wow, the power of the Christian right in the United States must be enormous. I actually think it might be the opposite, that this is the death rattle of this group that used to have a lot of power and feels itself waning. And
yeah, obviously they haven't won democratically on Friday.
No,
right?
Of course, absolutely not. It's just brute force. It's there's 3 ways out of an impasse. You can have a consensus, you can negotiate, or you can use brute force. And abortion is like this is basic social problems theory, and abortion is the quintessential position issue, and they have not been able to get past this impasse. And so when one group is able to, they just impose brute force, and this is what's happened here, because they can't get beyond this.
I mean, to go back slightly to talk about when you were talking about kind of not caring about the consequences and just trying to win these symbolic victories. My favorite example of this, which I've told about half a dozen times, is when some kind of anti-smoking NGO group got a law which banned vaping in public places, passed in an American city. And then there was like a video of American police like brutally beating up a black teenager for vaping in public, and the advocacy group was like, this isn't what we push for. And it's like, no, it literally is exactly what you push for.
Yeah. Like who do you think enforces laws? Like they're shocked. Like there's this horrible story of like a woman who was like hogtied in front of her kids, and her like arm was dislocated, and the whole point of it was like she wasn't watching them closely enough in a park, and someone called the cops on her when her kid wandered off for a minute. And they like hogtied this woman, dragged her out of her house in front of her kids while they were screaming and crying. And it was like, well, when we put these like well-being checks in place, that's not what we had in mind. Yeah, okay, but when you say, well, we better bring the police along, that's what you're saying, right? When you're saying that privacy is dangerous and we need to peer inside families a little bit more, you are chipping away and you are at these hard-won rights, and you're allowing this sort of thing to happen.
I mean, you saw the last week the stuff about vaping and stuff about cigarettes, right, in the US?
No, I didn't. What happened?
Well, Zool, the biggest ban of vape, has been withdrawn from the market on federal order due to safety concerns. And the Biden administration is planning to basically, in essence, ban tobacco, make tobacco illegal by changing what you can legally put in tobacco in a way which there isn't kind of sufficient nicotine content for the cigarettes to be cigarettes, really.
Okay. Right. Okay.
You should be able to smoke and you should be able to vape. And obviously it's not. And to draw no equivalence, because one doesn't really matter and one really does, the Democrats are obviously not at all committed to bodily autonomy in the United States.
No,
even if they use this language. Beyond any stuff with vaccines, they've been fucking banning big gulp sodas for 15 years, 20 years. And now they're attacking vapes. And obviously then they're taking away what young people like, and then kind of crying that they're going to lose the election still.
Well, that's exactly it, right? Like this was going to happen for a long time. First of all, because Roe v. Wade was not a great judgment. It was quite flimsy, and it was probably going to fall eventually. But this was a long time coming, because the idea of autonomy, the idea of freedom of the individual is so far away from what most people who consider themselves left now think of as a value. They think of it as a problem, as a danger. And so they'll create all sorts of harms, because we all know that the end of freedom, is where harm to someone else begins. So you have this whole industry of people creating these secondhand harms on the basis of very, very flimsy evidence, because they are trying so hard to chip away, I keep saying this, but at these kinds of liberal ideals. Not only do they not hold them themselves, they've completely ceded them to the right, which actually is not the traditional seat of these kinds of liberal values. And we're going to see this. I was going to say, so why I kind of wandered off there, sorry, is that the reason why I bring up this symbolic politics is that what Gusfield says in that book is that symbolic crusades become more powerful when material struggles have ended. When we perceive the status quo and who gets what, and control over the workplace and this sort of thing is just a done deal. There's no questioning it anymore. And this is long before the age of Tina. There is no alternative. Then we see people fight more and more about cultural things, about, I can't control the material aspects of my life, but I can control how you live your life. I can have a meaningful argument, and maybe I can have some effect on some kind of moral ground, on some kind of symbolic ground. And this becomes the space of politics. Like, why would you go, like, I remember sitting in a meeting where they were like talking about banning vapes on campus. And I was like, why are you doing that? And it was like, well, and you just knew it was like, because those people are breaking the rules and they're getting away with it, even though it had no substance, no material basis in reality. It was we won. This is a bad thing. And you're still doing this bad thing. How dare you? That's what it was about. Yeah, that's the substance of politics.
It's fun to kind of see people trying to like construct circumstances under which it's like morally required that you ban vapes, because obviously with cigarettes the push was based on secondhand smoke, right?
Yeah.
On the idea that kind of
by the way, was kind of flimsy, I must say. I'm sorry. It was.
I imagine it's pretty flimsy outdoors. I mean, it's the same thing with COVID, right? You can't really catch a cold outside. You can't really inhale much smoke outside. I've been thrown off.
I'm so sorry.
But obviously, yeah, with cigarettes, the point is secondhand smoke. But with vaping, there's no harm if you inhale secondhand steam. Beyond it being tiny and distributing much more quickly than smoke, it's really just incredibly insignificant. And so it's like the desire to ban it, like they push it on like basis of kind of like it smells bad, like it kind of smells a bit funky, and it's just it's not really impressive at all.
Yeah, and it's also like a very kind of older ideas of like pre kind of liberal ideas of like you shouldn't be allowed to dress meanly ugly and look ugly because it's offensive to the way other people, to the other people who are around you. Have you ever seen that? This like 1950s kind of videos where it's like, it's about respect to other people when you make sure that your boobs are nice and pert. Like you wear clean clothes and make sure that you smell nice because it's offensive. Okay, there's some truth in that, maybe, that like you don't want to offend people, but the idea that this is a basis for legislation is so
again, it's just a thing
backward.
Of like, you shouldn't like vape in someone's face, and you should try and like not stink, and you should like try and not look like absolute shit if you can, but that shouldn't like the law shouldn't get involved if I'm not.
Did you just showed a comment? Did you show this one?
Yeah.
That should be it should be illegal to embarrass yourself, because I do feel real harm when I cringe at other people's embarrassment. That's true.
Yeah, like definitely if I'm out in public, I feel I'm definitely way more harmed by people like embarrassing themselves than by people smoking.
Yes, there ought to be a law.
Okay, so we shouldn't give psychologists any kind of suggestions.
Oh no, don't even. You never know. It's beyond caricature now. Okay, so we had 3 articles, as we mentioned, in Sublation Magazine dealing with this, going back to when it was just kind of reverberating in the background. So we are going to start with abortion, capitalism, and demographic control. So this appeared in Sublation Magazine on May 17th, over a month ago. Stefan, could you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, so it starts kind of with historical tracking, kind of suggesting that abortion was broadly not prohibited during the mid to late medieval period, and then there was kind of a growth in prohibition as this era went on, and Conrad suggests this has at least something to do with the form of mercantile capitalism, which before kind of sufficient industrialization, the main way to kind of, you couldn't extend the working day in terms of like maximizing labor power by transforming like small laborer into machinery and this kind of stuff. Rather, the way to do was just to hire more workers and to make them work for longer. And in this circumstance, you can obviously see why trying trying to make women have more children, trying to confine women to the house and to prevent abortion and so on, is useful in terms of maximizing the population. But industrial capitalism comes along, and we have kind of the depopulation of the countryside as agriculture is industrialized, and then also in cities and towns, the main kind of growth in the 19th century came from machinery, where instead of it wasn't that 100 more workers were in the factory, it was that one machine could do the work of 1,000 workers, when previously either there was no machine or a much less efficient machine.
Mm-hmm.
And then Conrad suggests that this has something to do to why kind of restrictions on abortion were lessened throughout the 19th century and into the early 20th century. He goes on to discuss kind of as the United States reaches a fertility rate which puts it below replacement rate, and in fact in the same year that Roe was passed in 1973, they removed all national restrictions on immigration, and so the United States didn't have to worry about a falling birth rate unless you were kind of like a pure nativist, because there was no real threat of an aging population because there was mass immigration.
Mm-hmm. And so then,
you wanted to say anything?
No. So then
I didn't want to just detail an article for like 5 minutes solid.
Don't worry, I have no problem interrupting people. In fact, that's my problem.
Okay. He makes a point that while he's trying to suggest that the push towards abortion bans is something to do with concerns about birth rate and fertility, but obviously he is interesting, and Conrad's doing this. I don't want to single him out for this because I think this is a very common thing to do and probably something I do also. When you're talking about the past, you're very happy to kind of do kind of base materialism. You're kind of like saying, oh, in the past, well, this thing happened and this thing happened, and we put them together, and kind of, well, in the future, in the present and the near past, because we know so much more of the facts, we're willing to say like, oh, but there's much more complicated factors involved, just because we know about all the complicated factors. Well, because if we go further from the past, we have less and less information. Things become more and more stereotyped. Where he points out that kind of banning abortion is often not even very good at reducing abortions, and then definitely not very good at kind of increasing fertility rates. And Conrad makes a point which I very much disagree with, that rather than, even if abortion isn't very efficient for this, there is kind of like an ideological distinction between liberals and conservatives, between Democrats and Republicans in the United States, where liberals have the view of it's fine for our national fertility rate to drop because we can just continue to import cheap labor from abroad, while the nativist right are saying we can't continue to import nativist immigration. We can't keep importing cheap immigration. So we need to increase home fertility rates of the native population in order to cope with an aging population. And he suggests that rather than the ethical positions that people hold being based on kind of superstructural issues of culture and ideology and so on, they're instead based, he says, these ethical positions conceal what are at the bottom class positions. That in the end, what these represent are just two sides of these class positions, and the ethical issue is not, in fact, primary.
And he says that what we should do about it then is to try and put forward a position that protects rights, but also thinks about this reality of demography. Is that right?
Yeah, that Conrad has the perspective that socialists, obviously, as presumably we can all agree with, socialists need to make measures so that, having a child is as Ethan Lynham points out in a subsequent article, having a child is not a luxury, an unaffordable luxury for working class people, and that if you want to have a child, you should be able to. But I think Conrad, again, has a strange perspective here that a socialist United States or similar countries would need to have a birth rate above replacement rate, which seems very strange to me, especially in terms of kind of like, we need less and less labor. So it seems unclear to me why an aging population outside of a capitalist paradigm is really that much of a problem.
I guess the idea is, well, a socialist wouldn't argue this, but the idea is that you need a reserve army of labor to keep wages low.
Yeah, I mean, I guess his point is just kind of, we don't want to, socialism is not managed decline, right? As something I'm sure me and you are both very clear advocates of, and that socialism is kind of a state above capitalism of much higher productive capacity than our present state, but it's kind of undermined by what he makes clear earlier in the piece, that industrial capitalism doesn't require a growing population to do this, that it can grow and then reach socialism hopefully without needing a growing or even a stagnant population, because less and less labor is needed to produce more and more goods.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure about what a like properly socialist position would be. But one thing that I wanted to add was that a lot of the push for legalized abortion was also based on the fear that there was a ticking population time bomb, and that a lot of the providers had initially been concerned about population control. And so there's this kind of dark side to it too, from which the pro-choice movement has had a long time ago distanced itself. But that was part. There have always been concerns with population that have entangled themselves within this movement. Now, again, in the past, that appears clearer that that's what was part of what was going on. And also, you can look at the arguments that were actually marshaled in favor of legalizing abortion. A lot of the arguments were made openly about population. Now that is less acceptable, so it would be very difficult to be able to gather evidence on that basis. But the only thing that concerns me about this kind of, as you say, base materialism, this kind of crass materialism that one can find themselves falling into, is that you can't just kind of say like, oh, well, there's this concern here. There appears to be this thing at the material level, and here we have this superstructural thing, this discourse or this thing that's come up. One thing must cause the other. No, because you have to look at, well, what actually were the groups that were involved in this? What were they saying? What arguments were being put forward here? You can't just kind of guess and say that's what's going on. It might indeed be down beneath the surface, but it could be something else. You know, I remember, go on.
I think Comrade's article, I think I just called him Comrade instead of Conrad. I think Conrad's article is worthy in the sense of, it's a piece where it's like as if we just took and we said, we can only talk about the base, we can only talk about class analysis. What would our answer be in terms of why these two factions of capital are fighting over abortion? And I think in that sense, it's the best answer that you can really get. It's sensible, and he doesn't exaggerate the evidence that he has. He makes clear that abortion doesn't really make that much of a difference. But obviously, we don't need to do this in the sense we can include. We don't have to just look at the base. We don't just have to look at class analysis. And rather, what I would say is, because abortion doesn't make that much of a difference, it seems, to the population one way or another, that rather we should analyze it as something which is primarily superstructural. And it's for me, it's not hard to see why. On one hand, you have people who think abortion is murder, and then you don't need any class politics to motivate that. Obviously, the question then becomes, how do people come to think this point? But if abortion is murder, of course we need to prohibit it. And of course, it's kind of the biggest issue in the United States, that kind of millions of children are being murdered and half the country doesn't see any problem with it. While on the other side, it is also abhorrent that kind of these reactionary religious right want to like heavily intervene into the lives of women and control them and prohibit them. And also it clearly seems that these theocrats have no plans to stop an abortion, as was made clear in the Supreme Court ruling, where also decisions that were made on a similar basis, which legalized contraceptive, which legalized gay marriage, which legalized sodomy, were also then thrown up for debate.
Well, I think, I don't know. I think that I would have a different view on why. I tend not to think that an issue will speak for itself and find its way onto the public agenda as is of its own volition in a way. I think, like, if you think about cars, this is the like classic example, like kill huge amounts of people every year. And yet we still drive them, right? It's not like just the huge number of people that are killed, not just every year, every day around the world speaks for itself. Ergo, we shouldn't have cars. No, we value the freedom that cars give us more than that. It just doesn't.
This is starting to happen. I don't know if you've seen "fuck cars" on Reddit.
Well, that's what I was going to say, is that I can well imagine someone taking hold of that and organizing around it, but you have to explain that whole process of taking hold of that, organizing around it, crafting it into a narrative that will speak to people, then finding a political opportunity.
I'm just saying that there's a lot of material there to work with abortion. It's not something like it's not like vaping. It's way easier to work with than vaping,
right?
Like that,
Okay.
right?
Yeah, no, I get what you're saying. Absolutely, that it's easier to sensationalize, moralize, and make it a difficult issue. But that can only happen in a particular climate. This is the thing that, like, what I think a mistake that people often make is that they're like, oh, I'm doing materialist analysis. This thing is happening. And they go straight to the base. What's happening in the base? Like, you can't disconnect these things. You have to understand what the issue is, how it happened, what's going on, what interests are at play, what are they arguing, what stories are they trying to tell about to justify what they're doing. And then you can drill down to the base. And it'll be some aspect of the base that you might not have guessed. Right. And this is the issue, because people are, when they fight over issues, they're trying to solve a problem that's real in the world, even if they do it in a way that's really far removed from that problem. But you'll never know what that issue is if you don't actually like listen to what they're arguing and piece together what it became now, as opposed to what it was before. It might be the same thing. It might be down to population. But you can't just know that de facto. You have to figure out, well, who are the main parties here? What are they doing? Why is there this push? Why was dissent not as effective as it has been in the past, and so on and so forth? It's just a warning against this kind of crass materialism where you just like assume you need to go look around in the base and go blam. People do this. I use this example all the time. Sorry, I have to vary my examples, but like my own research, I saw people like, oh, everybody's talking about happiness now. Why? And then they'll go base. And they're like, because capitalism is so bad, it's making everybody unhappy. Well, look, capitalism can be bad, and that can be expressed in all sorts of ways. Capitalism has been really, really, really bad, like the Industrial Revolution, where you had like kids getting their limbs ripped off in machines and that kind of thing. And people weren't like holding banners for happiness, right? There's no obvious relationship by which aspect of the base produces the superstructure. You have to understand what stories people were telling about happiness. What were they trying to justify? What contradictions were they trying to work through discursively that were reflecting some real problem in the world? And only by digging through that do you eventually come down to some aspect of the base.
I think big sign is what's caused the latest abortion decision. Because obviously if we ban abortion, the sales of signs go way up. And so obviously...
What? I don't understand.
I'm saying that companies that sell signs, they're going to make a load of profit because of this decision. And thus clearly, if we look at the base, we realize that Roe v. Wade was overturned by big sign.
Yes, clearly, exactly. It's like, who stands to make money? Okay, so the second article that we have in the magazine is from this week, a couple days ago, Wrong Life and Abortion by Ethan Lynon. Do you want to do the honors?
Yeah, sure. So Lynham's point is to say that yes, kind of it's in response to Hamilton's article, saying that yes, it's right about kind of understanding the kind of ideological relation between kind of these factions of the bourgeoisie, but he's not impressed with kind of the suggestions for the left in this circumstance. And what Lynham suggests, did you make that go?
No, it just happens magically. Keep talking.
And what Lynham suggests is that the left should focus on two things, which on one hand seems sensible, on the other hand, to me, seems definitely not sensible. One is kind of the idea, at least, or sensible if it can happen, is of kind of building dual power. In terms of regardless of what the legal status of abortion is, leftists should focus on trying to make, in the communities they're kind of significant in, trying to make it safe and viable. On one hand is this idea of kind of I just fainted.
Just ignored your own notes. So there's a function within capitalism, right? That's what's being argued. And Lynham says that that's not exactly what's going on. Yeah?
Well, I mean, that's not what I was planning to talk about. But yes.
Okay. I'm trying to move to the next point. We're terrible substitute teachers. I'm sorry, Doug. We're doing our best. We don't have Doug's like cachet and his smoothness. You know, we're terrible amateurs here.
Well, I mean, Lynham makes the same points that Hamilton, that Conrad does, in terms of we must reject. Socialists want a condition where working class women, working class people are able to choose whether they have a child or not have a child. And on one hand, we're talking about abortion, but we should also concern ourselves with the positive aspect of having children. That it's not just that women are being forced to have children, but if we're serious about kind of economic realities, women are also being forced not to have children. Mm-hmm. And this is why he suggests this point of that the left should focus on trying to make it possible to have children. But he also, I don't know if he's an anarchist or just kind of inclined in the libertarian direction, but he's kind of rejecting Conrad's suggestion that kind of this works by throwing kind of vast resources into the state, which then pays these resources out to people. And rather that kind of socialists should take action directly in their communities. Movement should, instead of lobbying for the state to spend X money, ensuring that people can have children, should act on its own. And then the point which I find very, very strange, Lynham suggests that the left should ally or try to make an alliance with pro-life people. And in this, he focuses on Catholic social teaching, which basically makes the same point, that that people are being forced to not have children. And this is also a sin if the kind of material circumstances for women, for families to have children don't exist, then something is going wrong for the Catholic Church. I
think that this is actually a really good point that people should take to heart, because as we've kind of given up on solving problems like broadly in society, you may not have noticed, but a lot of problems have been pushed back onto the family. And you can see these kind of like progressive type people being like, oh, it's the parents, blah, blah, blah. As though, and you know, that's a talking point on the right as well, that you should have personal responsibility and it all starts in the home. And we've really sort of absorbed this kind of rhetoric because it seems kind of caring, right? Like we care for the vulnerable. Who's more vulnerable than a child? And what we've actually done is we've made parenting, first of all, into a verb, which is a new thing. It's only been around since about the 1960s. And we've made it very, very difficult. And so, you know, this is what Lenin argues that children are becoming these unaffordable luxuries for workers. And that's not just an objective thing that's happened because we don't have enough money. The actual parenting has moved from a relationship to a process, to a skill set that is, as Sharon Hayes says, emotionally absorbing, labor intensive, and financially expensive. And we see that as just, well, that's what parenting is. It is extremely, extremely intensive. And you should be, highly educated and, know how to do a thorough literature review before getting pregnant. And when you do, the literature review expands and expands. And you should approach this whole thing like it's a job.
In COVID, everyone was expected to be like a high school teacher, right? As well as doing their job.
Yes, absolutely. You had to, it was like the pinnacle of the expectations of society, which is like, and I had people saying this to me as well. How dare you were expecting the schools to raise your children for you. Oh, what a shame you have to raise your children yourself now. In addition to working like 60 hours a week, first of all, historically, the parents were not sat there on the floor like, oh, are you speaking yet? Have you said your 4,000 words before age? No, you had tons and tons of kids, and the older kids raised the younger kids. And the village tended to raise the kids. You did not sit there. Like, you raised the first one, but after that, it was kind of a domino effect. And you'd always have like a 5-year-old kid dragging a toddler around. That was the norm. But because we expect that you're supposed to be an intensive worker and an intensive parent, it's become absolutely impossible. And no wonder it is now a financial luxury that is just totally set up away from what working class people, they've just set up as though this is like what parenting is a middle class thing now. A middle class. It sets up your children
well for kind of a lifelong of kind of surveillance and control, kind of the surveillance and control you're expected to exact on them when they're very young. Did you see that kind of map that was in a newspaper which showed kind of it was like 4 generations of a family, how far they'd been allowed to leave their house, the distance they'd been allowed to journey at age 9. Mm-hmm. And for the great grandfather, he'd been allowed to walk 5 miles. And then the grandfather or the grandmother actually had been allowed to walk about a mile around. And then the mother was about 500 meters. And then the child was about the end of the street.
Yeah, and now it's not even the end of the street. Some people don't allow their children out on their own at all until they're like 12, 13 years old. I was 3.5. I remember being like, I'm this many and a half, riding my bike along the road, totally by myself, going to strangers' houses and being like, do you have a child I can play with? Like, that's what my mom told me to do. That's what I did when I was a kid. And now, if the idea that I would allow my 6-year-old out without any parental supervision is just, that's a very common thing that we talk about in parenting culture studies, the fact that the freedom of the child, and in fact, the whole universe of socialization that's not totally spontaneous, but develops between children in the absence of adult supervision is dying, is gone. Because all sorts of things I did without my parents around, and I'm sure that they would have been quite horrified to find out, but you had this kind of spontaneous socialization that would develop among children, and you would develop your own social norms. Now I'm always hovering above my children, telling them what to say and what not to say. And this is I've been told this is my responsibility. This is what I'm supposed to do.
I mean, at 8 or 9, I went 30 miles on the bus with my friends. And I was saying that to some friend who's from a major metropolitan in the US, and it's I'd want to stop them and be like, what the fuck are you doing? And where are you going? Why have you been allowed out?
Yeah. Oh yeah, and people will call the police. There's a whole Lenore Skenazy is the kind of spokesperson of this thing called free range parenting, I believe. Anyway, I hope I'm not misrepresenting her, but it's this idea of kind of giving some of that freedom back to children so that they can learn autonomy instead of always being surveilled and watched and looking to someone else to develop a kind of judgment within themselves gradually over time. It's this kind of movement, and she has to actually say, we need to make it legal to allow that, because what happens is some parents who've espoused this philosophy and allowed their kids to go across the street to a park have actually had to deal with police And this is the thing, like, nobody's really standing up against that. Progressives are not standing up against that because they've gone so hard down into the idea of like protecting the vulnerable is the number one thing. We deal with caricatures and cliches. We don't deal and symbolic politics. We don't deal with the reality of what it means when you are obsessive about protecting the vulnerable and protecting children, and then you start to invite increased surveillance, even police action on parents. This is what's happened, and gradually, and then they go, oh gosh, why are kids so fat? Oh, the parents putting them in front of the screens. What are you supposed to do? You gotta clean the friggin' house and make dinner at some point. I can't be on the floor like
Sublation Media
entertaining them all the time. You know, it's become very, very, very difficult. So parenting has become much more difficult. And the other thing too that people find surprising is that the amount of time that parents spend with children in most rich Western countries has gone up, has gone up enormously. So people actually spend much more time with their children now than they did in the 1950s. This like magical era that people like to look back on, where the mother was in her pearls and heels and knew her place and raised her children well and made home cooked meals and all this sort of thing. She actually spent much less time with her children than is the case now, which if you know anything about history is not surprising.
Yeah, I mean, but obviously there's kind of, back in those days, they also had like a social democratic or social liberal system of where there was a club for everything, and a youth house and a youth club and youth everything. And obviously it's not that these children were just, they could be let out by their parents, but then still be within all these kind of structured activities. And I put Nathan's thing on the screen to say that obviously you're saying this kind of thing is being abolished, but obviously it's abolished slowest among the working class. And that means with these legalistic restrictions you talk about, again, that these things will strike the working class the hardest.
Mm-hmm. So that was our second article. We kind of traveled a little bit away from it, but I think it's I think it's an important point. This idea that children have become an unaffordable luxury. It's not only because the working class is so downtrodden, but because part of it is that progressives have become complicit in problematizing childhood and making having children a luxury that poor people cannot afford. And you see this argument made openly by the right. How dare you have children if you can't afford them? Well, like a child can cost as much as you want it to, basically, like depending on how you raise them, right? You can, like a potato sack is a good piece of clothing, okay? But like it can cost as much as you want. But now the ideal of parenthood is middle class, and like all of the studies that people like to point to are done in rich Western countries, mostly on middle class white families, and that's become the ideal, the scientifically verified ideal of how to raise children. And anything that deviates from that is seen as really bad. And actually, this is having really bad effects because people will then go into other countries where this is not the ideal and begin to problematize their families, which is a new form of colonialism. And I'm not overstating that. They're actually cases where they changed the family policies in countries. Western organizations have done this as part of bailout packages. So the IMF goes in and says, okay, you can have this big loan, but you have to give us control of your policies. And they'll like write up all these policies and put in these sorts of Western ideals for how you're supposed to raise your children. Now, it doesn't have a huge effect because these countries don't have the capacity to enforce a lot of these things. But they will often use that as a goad. Like, oh, look, all these countries around the world have this policy.
I'm just imagining some really sad article, a Guardian article, where they're like, Togo isn't enforcing their smacking ban.
Yeah, a country that has like problems with childhood AIDS isn't concerned about corporal punishment. In fact, corporal punishment is the norm all around the world, except for rich Western countries. It's been that way throughout most of human history, and they're very upset by this. I think they have bigger fish to fry. Okay, so our third article, unless you wanted to say something else about the second article.
Oh, you put the other one back up.
Right. So, A Popular Struggle for Abortion by our man Gene. Hope that I haven't misgendered him, but go on. Do the honors.
Yeah, I mean, the piece isn't, theoretically heavy. I think he makes a very important point. I think that while we can fuss around with kind of legalities and whatever, Roe versus Wade being overturned is bad because it will have bad outcomes for people who are pregnant and with their rights and with their healthcare and so on. He makes the point that that Democrats have obviously, it's not just that it wasn't Roe v. Wade didn't prevent the Supreme Court ruling didn't kind of override or prevent the federal government from passing a law which would legalize abortion nationwide. And in fact, that's what it allowed. And what we have now is a situation where the federal government couldn't do that. Though obviously they can pass a law and see what the Supreme Court would do to it. Obama kind of said that it was kind of top of his agenda to push a legislation which would kind of supersede Roe v. Wade and make abortion rights the law of the land. He failed to do this, as well as pointing out how Democrats don't. Obviously, they kind of act as if this is their top thing. This is a red line, but they'll support kind of pro-choice candidates in southern states where they're trying to win elections. Mm-hmm. And so on this basis, he suggests that instead of us, trying to vote harder or trying to get leftists focusing all their energy on trying to get Democrats elected to the highest positions in the state so they can appoint Supreme Court justices and eventually overturn this ruling in 30 years or how long the fuck it'll take, is instead to focus, he suggests that people donate to abortion funds and abortion charities and so on. But I think the main interesting point that Jean makes is the idea of state referendums. So state referendums are relatively common in the United States, and they're common in states which are red states, which are the states which are likely to ban abortion. For instance, Montana, which is a deep red state, is a state where there is no trigger law and where no abortion ban will be passed, because in the 1980s they had a referendum on privacy. We never actually talked about kind of what privacy means in US law, but from what I know, it's to do with bodily autonomy, right?
Oh, I thought we had agreed beforehand that we weren't going to go into the
minutiae
of U.S. law.
You kind of explained it. No, I just wanted to make that point.
Mm.
Okay, it's something to do with bodily autonomy. We don't know. Who cares? Well,
that's what they decided.
Montana passed this privacy thing, and this legally means that a right to abortion cannot be infringed on in this state. And so Jean suggests, also because the pro-choice people are in a minority, even in kind of lots of red states, and now the pro-choice population is very highly activated because of the decision, that leftists should fight for state referendums on abortion, which, as well as kind of being it's a useful measure to pass a law, orientates the left as being clearly the ones which are in favor of democracy. The Republicans are the ones which are fighting in the courts. The Democrats are trying to fight back against them in the courts. Mm-hmm. And while we are trying to get people to actually be able to have their own say with state referendums.
Yeah, and I think I would tend to agree with that. And I think he makes a really good point that this is what needs to happen now. The issue is, as we began talking about, is that we are totally disempowered from being able to make these kinds of arguments. And so what people have been defaulting to is making moral arguments that are really, really flimsy. And we're having a lot of trouble making this democratic argument, making this sort of convincing argument for the autonomy of the individual, first of all, from a leftist perspective, and second, in a climate that doesn't really believe in that anymore, even on the left or the right. There's a very rare kind of person who believes in individual freedom to that extent. And like these sorts of liberal ideals on which on which legislation like this is based are on their way out. And so it's kind of a scary position to be in at the moment, in that we need to make these kinds of democratic appeals and very strong arguments, and in a climate that is very inhospitable to that. Yeah. So that's Jean's very simple kind of argument. That's what we need to do. We have to take democratic routes. We have to pull our socks up. We have to figure out what we're about. on the left and understand what's the basis of some of the positions we hold dear. We've been defaulting to kind of tribalism for a really long time. Oh, why do I believe in this? Because my people believe in this, and that's what the thing that we do as a leftist. In fact, I was going to joke a long time ago that we're like so close to a leftist position on anti-abortion, like because it's so much about like it's like we've traveled so far.
We need to let that fetus get out so he can get vaccinated.
Like we've traveled so far from the traditional bases, and traveled so far toward this kind of vulnerability as the be all and the end all and the basis of everything, that it's become very, very difficult to argue for these things, and actually much easier to argue against them.
Yeah, it was your point about tribalism. I don't want to be mean to the chat, but basically when earlier on you suggested that kind of the left didn't have like a good position on abortion, that kind of Roe v. Wade was a bit of like a shitty protection. People were like reacting as if this meant that you wanted to ban abortion.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Jesus.
Well,
Really?
they weren't saying that. They were saying like despite whatever you're saying, obviously it's right that we should be pro-choice or whatever. But that is to say, obviously, that was your point. Like there was no need for that addition.
No, what I was saying is that it was always recognized, even by pro-choice people, as not the very greatest legislation ever. And that's why there have been attempts in the past, in the intervening years, to bring up other aspects of the U.S. Constitution as a failsafe, because it was probably going to be overturned. The way that it had been interpreted was very, very broad. Like the Constitution was very broad to be able to say that there was a constitutional right to abortion. And so, but there were other things that you could look at in the Constitution that potentially could offer that right. And so people did try to bring cases, but they were not successful because they knew that eventually you needed to have many, many different safeties in place in order to protect the right to abortion. It was because it was a matter of time before Roe v. Wade would be overturned. I don't think that's a controversial thing to say. I think that's what most people who know anything about abortion policy in the United States would have said, I think, in the past. I'm not an expert in this area by any means, but that's my understanding anyway.
Ashley, are there any other news events in the past week or two that you're desperate to talk about?
My children no longer have head lice, and I've now switched to an eye infection that makes it very difficult to keep my eyes open. So I have not been paying a huge amount of attention to the news, except that, like, the last time I paid attention, like, I've not even been properly reading the newspaper. I saw that Johnny Depp won his case against Amber Heard. How long ago was that?
That was a while ago.
Was it? See, I've fallen down into, this is what happens when you're a mother. You begin to fall down these, like, because whose responsibility was it to comb all the lice out of my kid's hair? Anyways, but actually that was a point that I wanted to make earlier that really bothered me about some of the, like, an issue that's been sort of a perennial issue in the news is this idea of the gender pay gap, which became about mean people saying women can't do a job. No, it's because motherhood has become so difficult that you have to be an intensive worker and an intensive mother, and you can't do both of these things. You're going to fail. But if you're going to measure the success of feminism on how many CEOs there are, and without paying attention to the fact that at the exact same time you're heaping a load of responsibility onto mothers, you can't but fail. So what happens is people will choose one or the other. So you have a lot of people who are turning away from having children because of the difficulty involved, and they don't want to have to do it. They don't want to have that kind of responsibility. They don't feel as though they are prepared for the kind of responsibility that society kind of heaps onto parents now, or so they go 100% toward work. It's just a choice that people can make. It's a totally viable choice, but it's made in a context in which parenting has become difficult. Or people will work part-time. And that's what happens with a lot of women. They will work part-time. And when you do that, you will progress less quickly in your career. When you have children.
Lots of women get stuck in MLMs.
What's that?
Oh, MLMs? You don't know them? Multi-level marketing?
Oh, MLMs. I misunderstood what you said. Yeah, because they promise you the ability to be an intensive mother, but also be a CEO, and be a boss babe, right? They promise you this like that ideal of the culture is that you can do both of these things. And of course, it's a scam.
And of course, the suggestion of kind of the trad right is just don't do work at all, which is obviously just like, I mean, it's an economic absurdity, right? It's not that women started working because they just thought it'd be a good idea one day. They did it because of the demands of capitalism.
Yeah. And of course, like historically, women worked as well. It's just a brief period.
Yeah, like I mean, when did women not work? Even if you kind of you're like you don't define domestic labor as work. When did women not work? Like one year in 1952 or something, you know? Like one perfectly placed year between kind of World War II and then the 60s revolution.
Yeah. So I don't think you can kind of talk about like whether working class people have the ability to afford families and we want to make it easier for them to be able to have families that shouldn't be a luxury without thinking about that whole culture of what's happened to parenting and family life. And I think we're not really reckoning with that as, you know, on the left or as, you know, progressive kind of movements. In fact, they're trying to like, because they've lost their ability to deal with social problems, they've actually gone further into surveillance of family life the first 3 years. Like, that doesn't work. Oh, let's go into the room. What you doing in there? Like, you eating and drinking correctly? Clearly, all the problems must be pre-pregnancy. They just keep going further and further back. And then you get like people saying like women of childbearing age, or no, sorry, women who could have a woman who could have children should abstain from alcohol, which is basically all women of childbearing age shouldn't drink alcohol. Yeah. But it's all done on this kind of like pseudo-progressive idea of a basis of protecting the vulnerable. But anyways, I kind of backtracked and I'm not talking about current things. What current things in the news did you want to talk about before we let our audience go?
Nothing really. I mean, well, obviously, I mean, if we'd run out of time, we had the reverse. If we hadn't spoken enough, I could then just blabber on about Ukraine for half an hour. But I don't think there's any need. What I wanted to say was basically everyone in our like Sublation Media Collective is a parent apart from me. And I think there's a massive amount of interesting things to say on the freedom of children, kind of the intensity of contemporary parenthood or whatever. But we haven't really made any videos about it.
Oh, really? How interesting. Yeah. I'll have to make a video about this. It's something that there are like a lot of issues that I can talk about. And I'm like, I can talk about them in a disinterested way. But for some reason, like the whole parenting culture stuff, I try to stay away from it. And I no longer do interviews on the whole smacking ban because it makes me so angry. It makes me so mad. I find it so difficult. And like when people like it really, really bothers me because they've made it so difficult. And also I can see like a like sore spot for me is obviously Indigenous issues and the way that Indigenous parenting is set up as the cause of problems by progressives in really progressive language, even though this is a very long-standing discourse of blaming parents for being unable to, you know, make good Christians or good liberal citizens because they weren't like the white woman in her pearls and heels, that sort of thing. And there's just total lack of self-awareness. And it's just this discourse is just totally spread. I find it so difficult to speak dispassionately about it. So I like to kind of, you know, talk about things that I don't feel so strongly about because it gets to be so, it makes me so mad. Like how many kids are being taken away from Indigenous parents at the moment is ludicrous.
Yeah. No, I mean like, but I think there's beyond even, obviously you're an expert on kind of parenthood and this kind of thing, but I think there's so many topics around the area, for instance, the freedom of children, which is not exactly the same topic. But I think it'd be something that's very, very interesting to talk about how, as parents, obviously, have been told that parenthood needs to be more intensive. It's not even that this really benefits children, I don't think, in the sense that because this means, as well as kind of fears about their safety and security, this is intensified like a regime of restrictions upon children, or kind of, and then the middle between that is the bad middle is where the parents don't have the time, but they don't want children to have their own freedom. And so they don't interact with them, nor do they allow them out. And so they do the fucking iPads.
See, I'm getting angry now. It's not like that. Like it's so Jenny Bristow calls this the double bind of parenting culture, where you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. Yeah. So the good mother is the one who is aware of and protects against any and all risk that could possibly befall her children, including the risks of avoiding all risks. So there's nothing you can do. So it's, so they'll be like, oh, it's the helicopter parents, blah blah blah. Who was it that scared us from allowing our children out? We just like one day decided to surveil them in a way that's incredibly difficult and intensive and life destroying. No, you told us that that's what we were supposed to do as a good parent. And if you don't and something bad happens, it's like, where were the parents, right? So this is the thing. You can't, there's nothing you can do. There's like, that was actually the advice that I got when I first got pregnant for my brother-in-law. He said, just know whatever you do, it's wrong. That's the situation that we're in, because there's I highly recommend the work of Jenny Burstow on this. The Double Bind of Parenting Culture is a chapter in a textbook called Parenting Culture Studies, and like I was reading an article recently on anxiety, and it was this guy who was like the author writing articles like, see, why we have so many anxious people now and anxious teenagers is because parents they did this thing. So what you can do as a parent is you can make sure that they don't have too many that they don't have anxieties. But then when they grow up, they might get anxious because they don't realize that bad things are going to happen. So then you have to make sure that they do have some anxiety. But then when they grow up, that anxiety can go out. And it was just like, it was such a damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of thing. And I thought he was going to
just 7 spiders a year, no higher, no less.
I thought he was going to laugh and like make a joke about how ludicrous what he was saying was. And instead he was like, what this underscores is the importance of parenting. Do you know? So like there's, and like George Lukianoff does this all the time where they're like, well, why do we have, snowflakes? Why is this snowflake generation? And he's like, oh, it's because of parents. Parents are like overprotecting their kids. And like a few years back, who was it? Is it the guy that he wrote that book with? It's not George Lukianoff, it's the other one. I can't remember, his name escapes me for the moment. But he was writing books about like the importance of happiness and like scientifically proven ways of happiness. Like this is the thing. You're like told that if you screw up as a parent, you're gonna like damn your kids for life. All social problems. If it was like we have this culture where like when you grow up and you have some kind of personal problem, you're like, what did my parents do to cause this? Like parents are the root of all evil, no matter what you do. And you will give your kids an iPad because you cannot work like that. You cannot have the children inside the house all day long and like sit on the floor and entertain them. The house has to be clean. There are things that you need to do. You have to cook dinner. Like it's extremely difficult. And if the kids are not allowed out to play with each other and your job is 100% on them all the time, socializing them, it's impossible. You're not going to be able to do it. And if you do try to do it, you're a helicopter parent. Sorry, but see, you see, I get mad.
I imagine there'll be like a cyclic system where kind of this new regime of parenthood they're trying to impose will be imposed to a lesser degree. But then obviously the bad outcomes will stay bad, or they'll change into different bad outcomes. And then they'll reverse and suggest kind of the things that they were saying were bad are now good. But the kind of the guilty party will always be the parents. It'll never be them.
Absolutely. That's exactly what is already happening, because
I bet this has been going on for ages.
Yeah, because the culture is deterministic. So we think that we have it's called parental determinism or childhood determinism, where we think that all social problems are caused ultimately rooted in childhood. We have a very limited idea of the fact that people can actually grow up and develop a sense of autonomy and free will. So these things are connected with our broader loss of the belief in the liberal subject, that you have reason, that you're capable of reflecting on your experiences and rationally making a choice. We're like, no, it's all determined from childhood. So then you set childhood and parenting up as something so important that it's, it becomes the root of all evil. And we don't question that. When things go wrong and the problems persist because they're not rooted in childhood, they're much deeper, they're material, that sort of thing. We don't question, oh, well, maybe it wasn't parenting. We go, wow, parents must really, really suck. So you just go harder.
It's getting worse.
Yeah.
It's having to do more and more.
Yeah, and you're just spending more and more and more and more time with your children, and it becomes very, very difficult. And yeah, people will opt out. They'll choose one side over the other. They'll either go the trad route, and I'm not saying that people will consciously choose a trad route, or some people will just I want to be able to devote all of my time to the children, or they will say I'm not doing it at all. It's because it's very, very difficult. So apparently there are a lot of comments that are saying just hire a nanny. Oh no, you will not escape the scorn of society because you are neglecting your duty as a mother to be 100% responsible for everything this child becomes, and also for the success of feminism and your company and your household bills. And if you try to not work and raise your kids, well, then you're a leech on society, etc., etc.
I often wonder what kind of, in kind of like London or kind of the biggest cities in the world, what's the maximum kind of nanny chain which exists? Like, for instance, obviously in the sense that very rich people will hire like a white, educated, British, kind of Oxford graduate person to nanny their children, pay them £100,000. And obviously if that nanny has children, they'll hire a nanny, which will be somewhere down along this line.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, will that person then hire a nanny? I'm just wondering what the kind of maximum nanny chain is. I'm thinking probably at least around 4.
Well, there are like studies of this actually.
Oh, okay.
The women who will come, obviously you know about this, they'll leave their children behind in another country being cared for by the grandparents to come and care for the children, and like the children of rich Western women. Who will nanny the nannies? Someone says. Who is the nanny? Okay, so we've been talking for about an hour and 20 minutes. We don't have a Patreon this week because I have to get back to my children. But I want to thank everyone for joining us. Please don't make fun of me too much in the comments for getting mad at the end. Told you I can't help it. And then
I was gonna say, like,
I wasn't mad at you, by the way.
We're gonna make content where Ashley's mad at things. And it's gonna be engaging.
What's that Family Guy thing where it's like, this really grinds my gears?
Well, I'm like really shitty 2006. Oh, I've just given myself Princess Leia hair.
Okay, so before we sign off, did you have anything that you wanted to add or any questions that you wanted to answer from our beautiful audience?
No.
Dead air. All right, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and we'll see you next week on the Sublation Magazine Show. Our horrible substitute teacher signing off. Bye.
In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.